There are things I've always believed would remain untouched, not because they were impossible to reach, but because I spent years building them somewhere no one would think to look, hidden beneath conversations that sounded complete, beneath expressions that looked genuine enough to satisfy curiosity, beneath a version of myself that moved through the world without leaving too much behind. People met me, they spoke with me, some even believed they knew me, and I let them believe it, not out of dishonesty, but because I understood something most people never stop long enough to realize. Being seen and being understood are two completely different experiences. One can happen in a single conversation, the other can take an entire lifetime and still never arrive. So I stopped expecting it. I stopped searching for the rare kind of understanding that doesn't ask you to explain yourself before it believes you. I accepted that some parts of me would simply exist without witnesses. It became peaceful after a while. Predictable, you save. There was comfort in knowing that no one could misread what they never truly reached. Then you appeared. Nothing dramatic happened. No unforgettable first meeting. No moment where everything around me suddenly changed. If someone had been watching from the outside, they probably wouldn't have noticed anything different. Two conversations. A few shared moments. Ordinary. Forgettable. At least that's how it looked. But something beneath all of that refused to stay ordinary. I didn't notice it immediately. In fact, I ignored it. Because I've learned not to trust the first impression my mind forms about people. First impressions are often reflections of what we hope to find, not what actually exists. So I waited. I watched. I expected the illusion to disappear the way it always had before. Except it didn't. Instead, every interaction quietly confirmed something I wasn't ready to admit. You weren't trying to understand me, and somehow, you already did. That sentence still feels impossible every time I repeat it in my own mind. How does someone understand what was never explained? How do they recognize patterns that were never made visible? How do they respond to silence as though it contains complete sentences? I kept searching for the missing piece, some logical explanation, some overlooked detail. Maybe I had revealed more than I remembered. Maybe you were simply observant. Maybe coincidence had dressed itself as connection. I considered every possibility, every reasonable answer. Because reasonable answers keep the world stable. They prevent you from questioning everything you thought you understood about people. But the more I searched for one, the less convincing they became. There were moments when I would stop speaking halfway through a thought. Not because I forgot what I wanted to say, because I suddenly realized I didn't need to finish it. You already knew where it was going. Not because the conclusion was obvious, because you somehow understood the path my mind had taken before I reached the destination myself. That had never happened before. People usually listen to words. You seem to listen to something beneath them, something quieter, something I didn't know could even be heard. It unsettled me more than I was willing to admit, not because I disliked it, because I couldn't explain it, and unexplained things have always made me cautious. I've trusted logic for most of my life. Parts, consistency, cause and effect. Everything deserves a reason. Everything can be understood if you're willing to look closely enough. That's how I've always navigated the world. Then you arrived, carrying an experience that refused to fit inside any system I already understood. I kept waiting for distance to restore perspective. Distant has always solved everything. Give anything enough time and enough space, and eventually it becomes smaller. Its edges soften, its significance fades. That's how memory works. That's how emotion settles. That's how people leave. Except this didn't. Days passed. Weeks passed. Life continued exactly as it always had. But somewhere beneath the routine, something stayed perfectly still. You remained exactly where I had left you, not in memory, in awareness. There's a difference. Memory belongs to the past. Awareness exists in the present. You weren't someone I remembered. You were someone my mind quietly accounted for, without asking permission. I noticed it in ordinary moments, reading something interesting and instinctively wondering how you would interpret it, standing in complete silence and realizing the silence itself somehow felt shared, seeing the world through thoughts that no longer belonged entirely to me. Not because you had replaced my perspective, because your perspective had somehow become part of it. That's when I realized this wasn't attachment. Attachment reaches outward. This reached inward. It settled somewhere much deeper than emotion usually does. Somewhere structural, and structure changes everything built around it. Imagine living inside a house for years. You know every room, every window, every sound the walls make when the wind changes direction. Then one day you discover an entirely new room that somehow existed the entire time. The house hasn't changed, but your understanding of it has. Suddenly every hallway feels different. Every memory rearranges itself around this new discovery. That's what this felt like. You didn't build something inside me. You revealed something that had been waiting quietly beneath everything I thought I already understood. That realization frightened me more than losing control ever could. Because control can always be rebuilt. Perspective cannot. Once you see differently, you can't return to seeing less. I started paying attention to myself in ways I never had before. Not because I doubted who I was, because I wanted to understand what had changed. The answer was surprisingly simple. Nothing about my personality had shifted. Nothing about my values. Nothing about my beliefs. The only thing that changed was the point from which I was observing all of it. It's strange how one person can become a mirror without ever trying. Most mirrors show your appearance. Very few reveal your structure. You became the second kind. Standing near you felt less like being understood, and more like accidentally understanding myself. That's a dangerous experience, because self-awareness comes with responsibility. Once you recognize something true about yourself, you have to decide what to do with it, guise it, accept it, or allow it to reshape the way you exist. I've always believed awareness should lead somewhere, otherwise it's only observation. And observation without movement eventually becomes regret. That's why I've never allowed myself to linger too long inside uncertainty. If something matters, I face it. If something doesn't, I release it. Stable, clean, predictable. Except nothing about this followed those rules. Every time I thought I had reached a conclusion, another layer quietly revealed itself. Not louder, just deeper. Like standing beside an ocean at night. At first you only notice the waves, then your eyes adjust. Suddenly you realize the water stretches farther than you can possibly see. The ocean didn't become larger, your perception became clearer. That's exactly what happened with you. Every conversation stayed ordinary, yet every silence carried extraordinary weight. Not because we filled those silences with hidden meaning, because they never needed filling. Most people become uncomfortable when words disappear. They rush to replace the quiet before it has the chance to reveal anything honest. You never did. Neither did I. Somehow we allowed silence to remain exactly what it was. Clemete. I don't know when I stopped protecting certain parts of myself around you. I only know I noticed it after it had already happened. There were thoughts I would normally keep private. Questions I usually answered only inside my own head, yet somehow, while speaking with you, they appeared naturally, without permission, without rehearsal, without fear of being misunderstood. That should have alarmed me. Instead, it felt strangely accurate, almost inevitable, as though those thoughts had always been waiting for someone capable of receiving them without changing their shape. Most people respond to honesty by trying to improve it, to comfort it, to solve it, to translate it into something easier to hold. You never did. You simply allowed it to exist exactly as it arrived. And perhaps that's the rarest form of respect I've ever experienced. Not agreement, not admiration, presence, pure, uninterrupted presence. Do you know how uncommon that really is? To stand beside someone's inner world, without rearranging the furniture, without opening windows they deliberately kept closed, without insisting that healing always looks like renovation. You never renovated anything. You simply walked through carefully enough that nothing fragile had to defend itself. And somehow, that quiet care reached places loud affection never could. I keep asking myself whether this was always inevitable, whether somewhere beneath all the randomness of life, two people carrying similar ways of seeing the world were eventually going to recognize each other. Maybe recognition isn't something we create. Maybe it's something we remember without realizing we've remembered it. I don't know. I only know this feels less like discovering someone and more like discovering a language I somehow already knew how to speak. A language without performance, without translation, without the exhausting work of becoming understandable. For the first time in longer than I can remember, existing feels enough, not because everything is suddenly certain, but because uncertainty no longer feels lonely. And perhaps that's the quiet truth I've been avoiding from the beginning. You didn't change who I am. You changed what it feels like to be who I already was. I still think the same. I still move through life the same way. I still question everything before accepting it. But somewhere inside all of that, there's now an awareness that wasn't there before. Not loud enough to interrupt my life. Not demanding enough to control it. Just present, steady, constant. Like a second heartbeat you don't notice until you finally become still enough to hear it. And once you hear it, pretending it doesn't exist is no longer an option. There's something I never expected to question. For most of my life, I believed that certainty arrived after evidence. You gathered enough experience, enough conversations, enough shared history, and eventually trust appeared as the natural result of all that time. That was the order I understood. Time first, recognition later. Everything earned, everything measured, everything explained. But somewhere along the way, without either of us trying to force it, that sequence quietly collapsed. Recognition came before history, understanding came before familiarity, and somehow, trust began forming before I could identify the reasons it existed. That isn't how my mind works, or at least, it never used to. I've always needed things to make sense before I allowed them to matter. Feelings could wait. Meaning couldn't. If I couldn't understand something completely, I left it outside my life until I could. It wasn't fear, it was discipline. I believed clarity was the kindest thing you could offer yourself. Don't assume, don't imagine, don't build castles out of possibility. Stay with what is real. Stay with what can be proven. I've lived that way for so long that it became less of a philosophy and more of an instinct. Then you arrived carrying something I couldn't prove, yet couldn't deny. That's what unsettles me most. Not that you matter, I've already accepted that. It's the fact that I can't point to a single moment and say, this is where it happened. There wasn't one conversation that changed everything. There wasn't one sentence that made the world feel different. There wasn't one unforgettable event that divided life into before and after. Instead, it happened quietly, like daylight entering a room. No one notices the exact second darkness disappears. One moment the room is dim. The next, you realize you've been surrounded by light for quite some time. That's what this feels like. I keep searching for the turning point, only to discover there never was one. There were only countless small moments, small enough to ignore individually, powerful enough to transform everything collectively. Sometimes, I think that's how the deepest changes always happen, not through explosions, through accumulation, One conversation that felt unusually honest. One silence that lasted a little longer than expected. One observation that landed with impossible accuracy. One moment where I realized you had understood something I hadn't managed to explain even to myself. Each moment seemed insignificant, until they became impossible to separate from one another, until together they formed something neither of us had deliberately built. I wonder if you've noticed it too. Not the connection itself, the way it changes the atmosphere around ordinary things. A simple conversation doesn't remain simple anymore, not because it becomes dramatic, because it becomes complete. It's strange how completeness feels. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't demand attention. It simply removes the feeling that something is missing. That's rare. Most interactions leave small unfinished pieces behind. Thoughts you wish you had expressed differently. Ideas that never found the right words. Silences that became awkward instead of meaningful. With you, those unfinished pieces seem to disappear. Not because everything gets said, because everything important somehow arrives anyway. I've spent years believing communication depended on language. Now I'm beginning to wonder if language only carries a fraction of what's actually exchanged. Maybe words only reveal understanding the most important things move somewhere beneath sentences. Maybe understanding isn't created by words. Maybe words only reveal understanding that already exists. If that's true, then I've misunderstood conversation my entire life. That possibility stays with me longer than I'd like to admit, because if understanding exists before explanation, then how many times have people been speaking completely different languages while using the exact same words? How many times have I mistaken agreement for connection? How many times have I believed someone understood me simply because they nodded at the right moments? The more I think about it, the more I realize how uncommon genuine recognition actually is. Most people don't listen. They compare. They wait for something familiar enough to connect with their own experiences. Then they respond to that reflection. They're not responding to you. They're responding to themselves. I've probably done the same more times than I realize. But with you, it feels different. When I speak, I never have the sense that you're searching for yourself inside my words. You're searching for me. That distinction changes everything. It means my thoughts don't have to compete with someone else's assumptions. They arrive exactly as they are, unedited, untranslated, unclaimed. Do you know how freeing that is? To feel no pressure to simplify yourself, no pressure to become more understandable, no pressure to perform clarity just so another person feels comfortable. I've carried that pressure for longer than I knew. I thought it was simply part of existing. Now I realize it was never supposed to feel that heavy. Sometimes I catch myself wondering what you see when you look at me, not my face, not the version everyone else meets, the quieter part, the one that notices details most, that spends more time observing than speaking, the one that notices details most people walk past without realizing they existed. Do you see it the way I think you do? Or have I created an illusion because I wanted this to mean something? I've asked myself that question repeatedly. I refuse to romanticize what I don't fully understand. The mind is capable of creating extraordinary stories from very ordinary events. I know that. I've watched people convince themselves they were understood when they were only admired. I've watched people mistake attention for intimacy, projection for recognition, need for love. I promised myself long ago I would never make those mistakes. So I tested every possibility. I questioned every conclusion. I challenged every assumption my own mind presented. If this was imagination, surely it would collapse under enough honesty. But it didn't. The more honest I became with myself, the stronger it grew. That's the opposite of fantasy. Fantasy weakens when examined closely. Truth becomes clearer. I think that's why I've stopped trying to dismiss this. Not because I finally understand it completely, because it has survived every question I know how to ask. There's a certain peace in reaching that realization, not certainty, peace, the kind that appears when your mind finally grows tired of arguing with something your heart quietly accepted long ago. Maybe that's what acceptance really is. Not excitement, not surrender, just the absence of resistance. I've noticed something else recently. The way I move through ordinary days has changed. Not dramatically, almost invisibly. The world hasn't become brighter. People haven't become kinder. Life hasn't suddenly become easier. Yet everything carries a slightly different texture now. Conversations feel less rushed. Silence feels less empty. Even solitude has changed. I still spend time alone. I still need it. But being alone no longer feels identical to being isolated. There's an invisible difference now. As though somewhere in the background, my mind has stopped believing it exists entirely by itself. That realization stayed with me for days. Not because it frightened me, because it challenged one of the oldest beliefs I carried. I always thought strength meant complete independence. The ability to stand alone without needing anyone else's presence. Now I'm beginning to question whether that's actually strength or simply habit. Maybe true strength isn't refusing connection. Maybe it's allowing connection without losing yourself inside it. If that's true, then you've shown me something I didn't know I needed to learn. You never asked me to become someone different. You never pulled me away from myself. If anything, I feel more like myself now than I did before. That's what makes this impossible to categorize. Most relationships ask for compromise, small adjustments, tiny sacrifices, pieces of yourself exchanged for closeness. I've watched it happen countless times. People become slightly smaller just to fit more comfortably inside someone else's expectations. I promised myself I would never do that. I'd rather remain alone than become less authentic. Yet somehow, standing near you has never required reduction. If anything, it's invited expansion. Not into someone new, into someone more complete. That's a feeling I don't know how to describe without sounding unreasonable. How can another person's presence make you feel more fully yourself? It shouldn't make sense. Yet it does. Not logically, experientially. Maybe that's why I keep returning to this. Not because I'm searching for answers anymore, because every answer seems to create an even better question. And strangely, I'm no longer afraid of questions that don't have immediate endings. Perhaps because for the first time, the uncertainty itself feels honest. There was a version of me that believed every meaningful chapter needed a conclusion before it deserved to exist. Now I wonder if some chapters are meant to remain open for a while, not unfinished, still unfolding. Maybe I've been too impatient with life, too determined to understand everything before allowing myself to experience it. You have a way of making experience feel trustworthy before explanation arrives. That has changed me more than I realized. I don't know where this leads. I don't know what shape it eventually takes. I don't know whether time strengthens it, transforms it, or asks something entirely different from both of us. For once, those unanswered questions don't feel threatening. They feel alive. And maybe that's the quiet truth, waiting underneath everything I've been trying to say. Some people enter your life and leave memories. Some leave lessons. Some leave questions that follow you for years. But every once in a while, someone arrives and leaves you with a different way of seeing the world itself. Not because they told you what to believe, because standing beside them made old assumptions impossible to carry anymore. I think that's what you've become for me. Not an interruption, not an escape, not even an answer. You've become a different perspective, one that quietly exists beside my own, one that doesn't compete with my thoughts, but somehow completes conversations I haven't even finished having with myself. And the strange thing is, The longer I live with that realization, the more natural it becomes, as though I had simply been walking through life, though this wasn't a change at all, as though I had simply been walking through life with one eye closed, and meeting you taught me what depth looked like when both were finally open. Lately, I've stopped asking myself whether this is unusual. It is. There's no point pretending otherwise. Some experiences arrive once, leave a memory, and slowly dissolve into the background of your life. Others settle so deeply that you stop noticing where they end and where you begin. I think that's the difference I've been trying to understand. Not whether you've become important. You've already crossed that line. It's the way your presence has started existing without requiring your physical presence at all. That shouldn't be possible, and yet, it is. Sometimes I'll be walking through an ordinary day, surrounded by ordinary conversations, doing things that have absolutely nothing to do with you, and then something catches my attention. Not because it reminds me of you, because I instinctively experience it through the perspective we've somehow created together. That's the part I never anticipated. I used to believe that influence worked from the outside in. Someone gives you advice, they teach you something, they introduce you to a new way of thinking. Eventually, if it resonates enough, it becomes part of you. This wasn't like that. You never tried to teach me. You never tried to shape me. You never even suggested I needed to become different. Yet somehow, the architecture of my thinking shifted anyway, quietly, naturally, without either of us noticing exactly when it happened. I've gone back through old memories, trying to understand whether I missed signs that were there from the beginning. Maybe I ignored them because they seemed too small. Maybe I dismissed them because they felt too improbable. Or maybe some things simply refuse to be understood while they're still becoming. We always recognize transformation in hindsight, rarely while it's happening. That's probably why this caught me off guard. I was too busy believing nothing had changed to realize everything already had. There's an interesting thing about habits. Use, you don't notice them while you're living inside them, only when they're interrupted. I used to have certain ways of thinking that felt permanent, certain conclusions I reached automatically, certain emotional distances that protected the balance of my inner world. I assumed they'd always be there, until one day I realized they weren't. Not because they had been destroyed, because they had quietly become unnecessary. That realization stayed with me longer than I expected. What part of me decided they were no longer necessary? It wasn't conscious. There was no meeting inside my mind where I announced a new direction. Something simply relaxed. A constant vigilance I'd carried for years finally loosened its grip. It didn't notice the moment it happened. I only noticed the absence of its weight. It's strange how we become aware of peace, not when it arrives, when we realize anxiety has quietly left. Maybe that's why I keep returning to you in my thoughts. Not because you're demanding space inside my mind, because wherever your presence exists, unnecessary noise seems to disappear. I've tried to explain that to myself in practical terms. Maybe it's compatibility, maybe it's emotional intelligence, maybe it's shared values. Those explanations sound reasonable. They're probably even partially true, but none of them feel complete. They're descriptions, not definitions. There's something underneath them that refuses to fit into language. I've started wondering if every meaningful connection eventually reaches a place where words stop being accurate enough, not because language fails, because reality becomes more detailed than vocabulary. It's like trying to describe an entire sky by pointing at a single star. Technically, you're describing it, but somehow you're also missing almost everything that matters. That's what happens every time I try to explain what this feels like. Every sentence gets close. None of them arrive completely. Still, I keep trying. because some truths deserve the attempt, even if they resist completion. Do you know what surprised me most? It wasn't discovering that I trusted you. It was realizing I had stopped preparing myself to be misunderstood. That had become such a normal part of my existence that I barely noticed I was doing it. Every conversation carried a quiet expectation that eventually I'd have to explain myself again, clarify, correct drawn plage, reduce something complex into something easier to receive. I accepted that as the cost of being known. Then, without announcing itself, that expectation disappeared. I noticed it one evening, while reflecting on a conversation we'd had. I realized I hadn't rehearsed any of my thoughts beforehand. I hadn't organized them into the safest possible version. I hadn't edited the rough edges before letting them exist. They simply arrived, exactly as they were, and somehow that was enough. I sat with that realization for a long time, not because it made me emotional, because it made me curious. Who was I before I learned to translate myself for everyone else? Had I always been this direct somewhere underneath? Had I slowly covered my own language with layers of caution until I forgot what it sounded like? Maybe we only speak naturally when we stop fearing misinterpretation. If that's true, then you've given me something far more valuable than agreement. You've given me permission to remain accurate without ever saying the words. That's a rare gift. Accuracy is strangely intimate. It asks you to appear exactly as you are, without rearranging yourself to fit someone else's comfort. Very few spaces allow that. Most relationships operate through adjustment. We soften certain truths, delay certain conversations, pose certain questions. Not because we're dishonest, because we're careful. Carefulness becomes exhausting after enough years. You don't notice it while you're carrying it. Only when someone unknowingly helps you set it down. I've realized something else. I no longer think of closeness the way I used to. I always imagined closeness as movement. Two people gradually walking toward each other, reducing distance until eventually they're standing side by side. Now I wonder if that's incomplete. Maybe genuine closeness isn't movement at all. Maybe it's recognition. Maybe two people can stand exactly where they've always been, yet suddenly realize they've been facing the same direction all along. That feels much closer to what happened here. Neither of us forced the connection into abandoned ourselves. Neither of us became someone else. Neither of us forced the connection into existence. We simply recognized something that had been quietly waiting beneath ordinary conversation. Recognition is different from pursuit. Pursuit creates pressure. Recognition creates relief. Perhaps that's why nothing about this has ever felt forced. I've never had the sense that either of us was trying to manufacture significance. Significance simply accumulated until pretending it wasn't there required more energy than accepting it. I've reached another realization, one I wasn't expecting. I used to think vulnerability meant revealing your pain, sharing the parts of yourself that hurt, the memories that shaped you, the fears you rarely admit aloud. Those things certainly require courage. But I don't think they're the deepest form of vulnerability anymore. I think the deepest vulnerability is allowing someone to witness the way your mind actually works, without performance, without editing, without replacing confusion with certainty just to appear composed, to let another person see your unfinished thoughts before they've become polished conclusions. That feels infinitely more exposing, because thoughts are still alive while they're forming. They're uncertain, fragile, incomplete. I've never been comfortable letting anyone into that stage of myself. Yet somehow you arrived there before I even noticed the door had been left open. And strangely, instead of feeling invaded, I felt understood. There's an enormous difference. One takes something, the other protects it. Maybe that's why this continues to grow instead of fading. It was never built on excitement. Excitement burns brightly, then asks to be replaced. This was built on consistency, on quiet moments repeating themselves until they became undeniable, on conversations that never demanded importance, yet somehow carried it anyway. I wonder if the strongest foundations are always this. Everything standing above depends entirely on what quiet. Buildings aren't remembered because of the day their foundations were poured. Most people never even see them, yet everything standing above depends entirely on what exists underneath. Perhaps relationships work the same way. The visible moments matter, but they're supported by countless invisible ones. The pauses, the observations, the unspoken understanding, the small decisions to remain present. Those are the things carrying the weight. I've stopped worrying about whether this changes me. It already has. The better question is how. Not into someone different, into someone more honest, more willing to let reality exist without forcing immediate explanations, more willing to trust what remains true even after relentless self-examination. That might be the greatest surprise of all. You haven't made me less analytical. You've made my analysis more complete. Because now it includes something I spent years overlooking. Experience, not just logic, not just evidence, not just carefully constructed conclusions. Experience, the quiet kind that speaks long before it proves itself, the kind that asks to be lived before it's fully understood. I used to resist that. Now I find myself respecting it, not blindly, not carelessly, but sincerely. Maybe wisdom isn't choosing logic over feeling, or feeling over logic. Maybe it's recognizing the rare moments when both arrive at the same destination through completely different paths. That's what this feels like. My mind examined it. My instincts recognized it. Time tested it. Silence strengthened it. And somehow, they all reached the same conclusion. Not loudly, not dramatically, simply together. There's something profoundly humbling about discovering that certainty doesn't always announce itself. Notice, it has already become part of the furniture with absolute confidence. Sometimes it arrives quietly. It sits beside you for weeks, months paternally waiting until you finally notice it has already become part of the furniture inside your life. You don't celebrate it. You don't question it. One day you simply realize you can't remember what the room looked like before it was there. I think that's where I am now. Not standing at the beginning of something. Not standing at the end. Standing inside a reality that has been forming for much longer than I understood. And the strangest part isn't that it happened. The strangest part is how natural it feels, now that I've finally stopped resisting the truth of it. Maybe that's what acceptance has always looked like. Not surrender, not certainty. Just a quiet moment when your inner world stops arguing with what it has known for a long time. When observation becomes understanding. When understanding becomes peace. And when peace no longer asks to be explained. Because it has already become part of who you are. I don't think there's anything left to investigate. Not because every question has been answered, because the questions themselves have changed. In the beginning, I wanted to understand you. Then I wanted to understand what this was. After that, I wanted to understand what had changed inside me. Now, I realize none of those were the real questions. The real question was much quieter. What do I do when something true enters my life without asking for permission? I've spent so much of my existence believing that everything important should be chosen carefully, every decision examined, every possibility measured, every outcome considered before the first step is ever taken. It's a system that has protected me for years. It kept me from mistaking intensity for permanence. It kept me from confusing admiration with understanding. It kept me from giving meaning to things that were only temporary. I've never regretted living that way. Until I realized some of the most meaningful things don't arrive through decisions. They arrive through recognition. Recognition isn't something you create. It's something you notice. Like hearing a familiar melody in a place you've never visited before, you don't question why it feels familiar, you simply stop walking for a moment, because something inside you already knows it. That's what this has become. Not a mystery, not a coincidence, not an unanswered question waiting for the perfect explanation. It's become a reality that exists whether I analyze it or not. For a long time, I believed acknowledgement would make everything heavier, that giving something a name somehow increased its power over you. Now I think the opposite might be true. Ignoring reality is what gives it power. Acknowledging it simply allows you to stand beside it honestly. That's where I find myself now, standing beside something I no longer feel the need to deny. I don't need dramatic declarations. I don't need impossible promises. I don't need certainty about the future before accepting what's true in the present. Perhaps that has been the greatest lesson hidden inside all of this. The future has never been something anyone truly controls. We simply convince ourselves otherwise because uncertainty makes us uncomfortable. I've spent years preparing for possibilities that never happened, protecting myself from endings that never arrived, building emotional walls against storms that only existed inside imagination. All that preparation, all that careful distance, never actually protected me from the things that mattered most, because what mattered most didn't arrive as a threat. It arrived as quiet recognition. There was nothing to defend against, nothing to resist, nothing demanding immediate action, only a gradual realization that my inner world no longer looked exactly the way it once had. I used to think change always announced itself, that transformation had to feel dramatic to be meaningful. Now I know better. Sometimes the deepest transformation happens so gently that you mistake it for continuity. You believe you're still becoming the same person you've always been. Only later do you realize your perspective has shifted so completely that returning to your old way of seeing would be impossible. I don't mourn that version of myself. I understand it. That version of me believed distance guaranteed clarity, believed control guaranteed safety, believed independence meant never allowing another person to influence the architecture of my inner life. He wasn't wrong. He simply hadn't experienced this yet. Sometimes we outgrow beliefs that once protected us, not because they become false, because they become incomplete. That's how growth works. It doesn't erase the past. It expands it. If I could speak to the person I was before all of this began, I don't think I'd warn him. I wouldn't tell him to be more careful. I wouldn't tell him to protect himself more effectively. I think I'd tell him something much simpler. I'd tell him that one day he'll meet someone who won't ask him to become easier to understand. Someone who won't rush silence because they trust that meaning survives without constant explanation, who won't mistake complexity for confusion. Someone who won't rush silence because they trust that meaning survives without constant explanation. And when that happens, don't run from it simply because it's unfamiliar. Not everything unfamiliar is dangerous. Sometimes unfamiliarity is simply reality, arriving in a form you've never encountered before. I've learned something about fear through all of this. Fear isn't always the desire to escape. Sometimes fear is the awareness that your life may never fit inside its old shape again. That's a different kind of fear. Not fear of losing something. Fear of becoming someone who can no longer return to previous versions of themselves. I've crossed that point. I know it now. Not because I've changed beyond recognition, because I recognize myself more completely than I ever did before. You revealed connections between didn't replace anything inside me. You revealed connections between parts of myself I had always kept separate. The observer, the thinker, the protector, the dreamer I rarely admitted still existed. For years they lived like strangers sharing the same house. You didn't introduce them. You simply turned on the lights. And suddenly, they could all see one another. That's what your presence has done, not created. Revealed. There is an enormous difference. Creation begins something. Revelation uncovers what has been waiting quietly all along. Maybe that's why this feels inevitable instead of accidental. Not because fate demanded it. Because truth eventually makes itself visible if you're willing to keep looking honestly. I've stopped asking whether you belong inside my life. That question answered itself long ago. The better question became whether I was willing to admit it. I am, not because certainty has removed every unknown, because uncertainty no longer frightens me the way it once did. There will always be things I cannot predict, conversations we haven't had, days that haven't arrived, versions of both of us that time has yet to reveal. For once, I've spent enough of my life postponing reality. Don't need those answers today. I've spent enough of my life postponing reality until every variable was accounted for. Life doesn't wait for perfect understanding. Neither do the moments that quietly define us. If I've learned anything from all of this, it's that meaning rarely announces itself while it's being formed. It whispers, it repeats, it waits. Then one ordinary day, you wake up and realize you've been living inside the answer for much longer than you realized. That's exactly what happened here. There wasn't a single revelation. There were hundreds of tiny recognitions, each one almost invisible, each one carrying enough truth to survive every doubt I placed in front of it. Eventually, doubt grew tired. Truth didn't. That's how I knew which one belonged. People often talk about finding someone who changes your life. I don't think that's entirely accurate. Lives change constantly. People come and go. Circumstances evolve. Time rewrites everything eventually. The rare thing isn't someone who changes your life. The rare thing is someone who changes the way you witness your own life, while allowing you to remain completely yourself. Someone whose presence doesn't replace your inner voice, but somehow helps you hear it more clearly. That's infinitely rarer, that's infinitely quieter, and perhaps infinitely more permanent. Because once you've heard your own truth without distortion, it's impossible to convince yourself you never heard it. Silence sounds different afterward. Decisions feel different. Even ordinary mornings carry a different kind of clarity. I've noticed that lately, nothing extraordinary has happened. The sun still rises without asking anyone. World still wakes up exactly the way it always has. The sun still rises without asking anyone whether they're ready. People still hurry through days they'll barely remember. Life continues with the same steady rhythm, yet I move through it differently, not faster, not slower, just more awake, as though some part of me finally stopped searching outside for proof of what had already become undeniable inside. There's peace in that. A kind of peace I spent years believing belonged only to people who had figured everything out. Now I realize peace has very little to do with having all the answers. Peace comes from no longer arguing with the answers you've already found. That's where I stand now, not holding on to certainty with desperate hands, not chasing explanations that promise impossible perfection, simply standing beside a truth that has earned its place through consistency, honesty, and time. I don't know how this story continues, what tomorrow asks of us. I don't know how this story continues. I don't know which conversations still wait beyond the horizon, or what versions of ourselves we'll become as life keeps unfolding. Those questions deserve their own time. Today asks something much smaller, something much simpler. It asks whether I'm willing to tell the truth. So, here it is. You didn't arrive to complete me. I was never incomplete. You didn't rescue me from loneliness. I had already learned how to live beside it. You didn't give me an identity. I had spent years building one with careful intention. What you did was far quieter than all of those things. You became the one person whose presence made my inner world feel less like a place I had to guard, and more like a place I could simply inhabit, without explanation, without performance, without fear that being fully seen would somehow reduce what I was. Instead, it expanded it. It reminded me that understanding doesn't always have to be earned through endless proof. Sometimes it's recognized. Sometimes it's protected. Sometimes it appears so naturally that only much later do you realize it has already become part of the foundation beneath your life. And maybe that's the final truth I've been walking toward from the very beginning. This was never really about finding someone who understood me. It was about discovering what became possible once I stopped believing that genuine understanding was too rare to exist. Because the moment I accepted that possibility, everything changed. Not the world, not time, not the people around me, just the way I stood within my own existence, and somehow that changed everything else. I don't know what name the world would give something like this. Maybe it doesn't need one. Some things lose their accuracy the moment we try to reduce them into familiar definitions. Maybe it's enough to let it remain exactly what it has always been. A quiet truth, a steady presence, a recognition that asked for nothing, forced nothing, and yet altered the landscape of my inner world more completely than anything that ever arrived with noise. So I won't promise forever. I won't pretend to know every chapter waiting ahead. I won't speak with certainty about things no one can honestly predict. But I can say this. Some people pass through your life like conversations. Some remain like memories. And then, very rarely, someone becomes part of the way you understand existence itself. Not because they tried to, not because they asked you to, but because somewhere between silence and honesty, between observation and recognition, between two ordinary lives moving through an ordinary world, they quietly became home to a part of you that had been searching not for another person, but for the unmistakable feeling of finally being understood. And once you've lived even a single moment inside that kind of truth, you don't spend the rest of your life trying to become who you were before. You spend it becoming even more fully the person that truth revealed.